So I'm Tim Mason. I lead energy policy for the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C., and I am very excited to be joined by this distinguished group for a conversation about a little tiny topic, the geopolitics of energy, which is on, I think, everyone's mind now in ways that are increased from just a couple of years ago. So let me just start by introducing some of the distinguished panelists we have here. I have Robin Milliken, who's a Senior Director of U.S. Policy and Advocacy at Breakthrough Energy. She oversees the U.S. policy team within their policy and advocacy program. Breakthrough Energy is a network of entities and initiatives founded by Bill Gates, which include investment funds, philanthropic programs, and policy efforts linked by a common commitment to scale the technologies we need to achieve a path toward net zero emissions by 2050. I also have Anna Morris, who is the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. She's responsible for directing strategies to disrupt the financing of threats to national security and to protect the international financial system from abuse by illicit actors. Anna's global portfolio includes the most serious threats to national security, including Russia, China, North Korea, and global terrorism and corruption. I have Richard Newell, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Sustainability at enterprise AI software company C3AI, where he helps private and public enterprises digitally transform to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, conserve energy and water, and create sustainable supply chains. Until pretty much last week, Rich was the President and CEO of Resources for the Future, an independent nonprofit research institution that improves environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions through impartial economic research and policy engagement. And then finally, I have Vinay, who's the Senior Advisor at the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment at the U.S. State Department. He's a seasoned U.S. diplomat with close to 20 years of experience across the Middle East and South Asia. His work focuses on the intersection of foreign and economic policy and global growth markets. So a very distinguished group with lots of different perspectives. And I think the way that we should start is by talking about this issue of trade-offs, the ways in which energy security and our climate change imperatives are either in conflict or are reinforcing of each other in different ways. And why don't I just offer each of you the opportunity to comment in some detail on those trade-offs, how you think about them, and also the various opportunities or risks that they might implicate. Robin, you want to start?
I would be happy to. Okay, everyone can hear me. Well, first of all, sorry for you all hearing this for the 50th time, but wanted to say thank you so much to Maureen, Dimitri, Sarah's Silverado team. It's really great to be here because as a climate person, I spend a lot of time in my foxhole thinking about that issue, and coming to an event like this allows me to think about my work in a much more multi-dimensional way. So really excited to be here. I think, Tim, where I wanted to start in responding to your question about trade-offs is by acknowledging that, again, as a climate person, answering this question pains me a little bit because I'm like, I wish climate were a worthy enough goal in and of itself, but it is really important to be realistic and recognize that there are other national objectives that often take precedence, right? Energy security, national security, economic growth. And I think climate can be very much consistent with those things, but those are typically the issues that are front of mind. Energy is a $5 trillion a year industry. It underpins every facet and sector of our economy. It has historically been a big driver of GDP growth. That's no longer the case in many developed economies, right? We've seen that whereas historically it used to be very tightly coupled with GDP, we're now seeing decoupling in some markets. So I think that's encouraging in the way of indicating that energy access is not necessarily destiny, but it is a reality. Also, again, it underpins everything that we depend on economically, even the food that we eat, right? You need to burn a lot of natural gas to make ammonia for fertilizer to grow everything that ends up on our dinner table. So those are just basic realities that we need energy to be affordable, available, accessible, and socially acceptable in order for us to sustain all the things that are important to daily life. And also, it will just realistically never work to tell developing economies that they shouldn't expect the same standard of living that we've achieved by using copious amounts of energy to develop in places like the US. So I offer all of that in the way of prefacing that the good news, I think, again, is that these things can be made consistent. In terms of economic growth, I already mentioned we've seen decoupling, so we need not assume that the future of growth depends on fossil fuel supply. And secondly, I think there's also a lot of reason to believe that clean energy can be an economic opportunity for countries like the US. We sponsored a study with Boston Consulting Group that came out last year that looked at 10 key clean energy technologies, so everything from EVs to clean steel to clean hydrogen. And what they found is that those energy technologies can represent something on the order of a $3 to $4 trillion global serviceable market through 2050 each year. And I think we're really well positioned to capture that opportunity. And then lastly, pivoting to national security and the interplay there, clean energy is also very consistent with a national security strategy that contemplates how do we have an advantage vis-a-vis adversaries who have historically relied on their natural resources like fossil fuels to wield influence. We are in a really great position in that we are blessed with abundant natural resources, and the more we can diversify, the more optionality we have to wield influence in a reciprocal way. I think, for example, doing things like freeing up natural gas consumption domestically by using more clean energy allows us to export more LNG to regions like Europe and Southeast Asia, where we can both displace coal in those places and also displace the influence of adversaries that have malign intent. So I think all of these things can be made consistent. To answer your question succinctly, Tim, it just requires us to have a very thoughtful strategy.
Thank you, Anna.
Tim, thanks so much. So my angle on this is really the trade-offs, as I think about it, between our national security imperatives and energy security. And as you mentioned, my team is responsible for thinking about how we disrupt the financing of threats to national security. And if you look back over the past 10 years or so of U.S. government policy, when we deal with major global threats, whether we're talking about Iran or North Korea or certainly Russia in the past couple of years, we turn to the financial tool. With most of those adversaries that I just mentioned, they derive much of their revenue and therefore much of their ability to finance their destabilizing activities from fossil fuel sales. And so you have seen over the past 10 years sanctions campaigns that certainly have been targeted at Iranian oil and certainly have been targeted at Russian oil. And I think that what you could sort of expect for the future is that to the extent that there is an energy component to a national security threat, there will also be a restrictive financial response. So how do we think about this in terms of sort of global energy security? And I will say that after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we all saw global energy prices spike. Perverse results of Russia's war that then destabilized global markets. And the result was that Russia gained a windfall. They gained massive profits as a result of these disruptions that drove up prices for crude oil. And so the challenge that the Treasury Department took on was, well, how do you reduce the amount of revenue that Russia makes from oil on the global market while still keeping energy markets stable at a time when we were all facing persistent global inflationary pressures, when agriculture prices had skyrocketed, and when a carefully balanced policy to respond to Russia and to try to deprive it of the resources that it was using to prosecute in the war in Ukraine required that we not exacerbate those problems. I talked about this a little bit in my opening remarks, but the response to that was this novel policy that essentially said, Russia, we will allow you to use our services to sell oil on the global market, but you must do it at or below $60. That was for crude. And if you don't use our services, that's fine, but they comprise 90% of global services if you think about bunkering and insurance and oil brokerage. And you can then do that outside of the price cap structure. And what that did was it did effectively into 2023 reduce Russian oil revenues by 30%, which is meaningful, while keeping energy markets stable over that time. And so I think, U.S. policymakers going forward will be faced with these continual challenges that will touch on major global energy questions, and we'll have to think about how do we construct them in a way that is both effective to achieve our national security goals while also maintaining priorities with respect to energy stability.
Thank you, Richard.
So when I when I think about this, I think of it not so much in terms of trade-offs, but a changing landscape and changing dynamics. And really, there's two that I would point to. The first one relates to a history where, for about 50 years, the geopolitics of energy was really about global oil dynamics, right? And with oil being the world's largest traded good, 50% of oil moves across national boundaries. The price of gasoline, the price of refined products is front and center in politics. So that was where the geopolitics of energy really was. And that hasn't gone away. That is still an important part of the geopolitics of energy. But a new dynamic has emerged, which we've talked a lot about in this conference, which is not about fuels, but it's about equipment. And I think that as we transition in the energy transition, it's going to be, the geopolitics of energy is increasingly going to be about the geopolitics of materials and equipment. Clean energy just doesn't use fuel, or if it uses fuel, it uses less fuel. And so when you think about wind and solar and electric vehicles, it's mainly about the equipment that underpins that. And so that's increasingly going to be part of it. It's about supply chains, it's about critical minerals, it's about international trade in capital equipment. Now that's going to take time, right? And so there's going to be a period of time when we're have to be working through both of these geopolitics. So the geopolitics of energy could actually get more complicated for a while, but we just have to recognize that and work through it and manage through it. Second key changing dynamic, I would say, has to do with the fact that the United States is now the world's largest oil producer. The United States is now the world's largest natural gas producer, separately. And on top of that, the United States is now the world's largest LNG exporter. So not only the largest producer, we're also the largest exporter of LNG. So that changes the dynamic of the United States' position in the geopolitics of energy quite substantially from what it has been in the past. Now we've seen a tension because at the same time, the United States has also committed to having its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 on a path to net zero. But we have to work through that. And one of the key features there that I've already mentioned is the role of natural gas as a fuel, as part of the energy transition. So a key question is, how do we ensure as a country and as a world that natural gas is part of the solution? And I'll close in a second, but I think there's three key elements there. One is to ensure that methane emissions, so natural gas is methane. When you combust it, it creates carbon dioxide, but if you leak the methane directly to the atmosphere, it's in a potent greenhouse gas. So we have to solve that problem. It's a solvable problem. It's not quite solved yet, but we can solve it. We have to solve that problem, drive those emissions down to zero. Second thing, we want natural gas, when it enters into the global energy system, to be displacing coal and other high-emitting sources, not displacing clean energy sources. So that's another dynamic that if we want natural gas to be part of the solution, which I think we all do, we need to help ensure that. And finally, for natural gas to be part of the long-term solution, we need to couple it with carbon capture and storage. So we need to remove the carbon dioxide emissions that come along with natural gas. So as long as we have a plan over time to put the policies and frameworks in place to ensure this, I think things that look like trade-offs can actually leverage things like U.S. abundance of energy, also with a clean energy transition.
Thank you, Richard. Vinay?
Yeah, Tim, I'll try and be quick and probably take a view from an emerging markets perspective to talk about trade-offs. And I think one thing you have to recognize is what kind of trade-offs are we willing to accept for the sake of climate security and energy security from emerging markets, some of the ones that we want to have these alliances with. And the first thing about having some of these alliances is that the currency of a successful alliance is really trust and empathy. And so for me, and having done climate negotiations, discussions with a lot of emerging markets, you have to have trust that they do recognize climate change as a big problem, that they do sort of want to do the right thing, and that they're trying to move as fast as they can, but there's also trade-offs that they have to take into account, that not all economies can follow the same policy prescriptions that we can. A lot of countries don't have the fiscal space to pursue an IRA. Are we willing to accept the trade-off then in order to get to climate security, that they will require large tariffs or for solar supply chain as well, because they want it to be locally produced. Economic growth rates are different. You look at a country like India, 1 million people turning 18 every 30 days, growth rate of about 6.5%. They're doing 12 gigawatts of renewables a year, climate security. But it still means that they've gone from 74% coal to 72% coal in the last decade. It really hasn't shifted, even though they're doing so many renewables because they've got so much economic growth. They're saying we'll take cheap Russian oil, we'll take as much renewables as we can do, and we'll do as much coal as we can do. What are we willing to do as we work with them to try and help them move even faster? Indonesia, an archipelago of thousands of islands, we try and push them on climate security. And they say, look, we sit on a bed of coal, and you want us to switch to solar, which we have to import completely. So our energy security will become dependent on a partner like China. And we don't want to do that. We share that common challenge with you. We don't want to be dependent on a single market. So we're going to require that almost all solar panels be built in our country. So these are sort of the trade-offs, and what are we willing to accept, I think, becomes a hard nut to crack in emerging markets especially.
Well, Vinay, let's stay with you and let's talk a little bit more about development and the ways in which development can be, maybe reimagined or innovated that can be reinforcing of energy security and climate change imperatives that maybe might transcend the traditional playbook.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It's one thing that I've been surprised by is the sensitivity around capital and the cost of capital in emerging markets. Sometimes it's grant-oriented, sometimes it's loans that they just want. There's a fairness question of why does it cost more money, more interest for me to install a solar panel in my country than it does in yours, the United States. And of course, we can point to trade policy, we can point to their policy, bad policy that needs to be improved. We can offer what's traditionally technical assistance, or we can bring large amounts of capital. In South Africa, you have a very old coal fleet. 80% of the power system is dependent on coal. It needs to switch to renewables, but it's very much a race issue in that country, and it's a powder keg. Unemployment is close to 30%. It's perceived as renewables as something that's going to leave a large part of the country out of the system. So they spent a few years doing a just energy transition, internally building support for this shift, the energy transition. But with a country like South Africa, the dependency will be a lot on workforce training and how can the international community help through grant money, and then also help in transmission and build solar in the Cape. In Indonesia and India, it's just about bring lots of capital and bring it cheaply. And I think what we also realize is there's no way there's enough public money for this. I mean, the energy transition is going to cost more than $1.5 trillion a year. And rather than saying public money, I think it's private money. So we're in our office, we're trying to maximize private investment into some of these markets using as little public money as we can to de-risk. The challenge is the U.S. are the most, at least if we think about American finance, the most hampered and able to do that. We're victims of our own success. There's so much to invest in here. The IRA offers investment opportunity. We're dollar-based, it's safe, it's secure. How are you going to get somebody like CalPERS, a pension fund that has to sort of represent firefighters and teachers and give them a return here in California and say, hey, why don't you come and invest in Indonesia? So for the public sector, it becomes about de-risking. American finance and bringing capital. And I would say the last thing is the private sector. What I've been amazed by in a place like Indonesia, as much as we push and say we can bring a public package of money together, what moves Indonesia to move at least some ways towards solar, for example, is something like Amazon Web Services saying we also have a net zero goal. Jennifer was talking about it. And then they know they have to get more solar because the only way that data center service is going to be serviced is through renewable power. And how do we reinvent ourselves on voluntary carbon credits, et cetera? So those are some of the thoughts on that, Tim.
Before we go to innovation, I want to see if any of the other panelists want to weigh in on this question of development. That's okay. We can move on to innovation. Oh, you want?
I have some thoughts.
All right.
Well, in addition to everything that Vinay just said, which I think is spot on, I think the aspect of this that I'm most interested in is how do we think about things like development finance, trade, supply chain agreements in a much more integrated way rather than being disconnected levers that we pull. Because, for example, if you're in Indonesia, we could approach them and say we're interested in financing a clean steel facility there, but once that clean steel is produced, where's it going to go? And if you have trade agreements that provide for a market that values the clean attribute of that steel that we would like Indonesia to produce, it's beneficial for everyone involved. And I also think there's a geopolitical benefit to it in that if you're Indonesia and you want to urbanize and have your own indigenous steel industry, you need to be really worried about excess capacity in China looking for new markets in 5 to 10 years. And so if there's a trade policy that penalizes that steel for being not up to the standards of us and hopefully Indonesia if there were some kind of climate club arrangement. And if we could pair that with development dollars that support Indonesia's own ambitions to have, again, an indigenous steel industry, I think that is a really interesting way to think about the problem more holistically, and I'm hoping that's where we as a policy community can start heading in that direction, because I think making those projects bankable is going to be key, and we have a lot of existing authorities that could be put to work to do that.
Richard.
Actually, I do have a comment on this. It's a little bit more general than just developing countries, and it actually may be a bridge to an innovation discussion. So one of the things to recognize is that the United States is kind of unique, right? So when we enter into a conversation about what does global innovation look like and what does a global surmounting of the climate challenge and energy challenge look like, we need to remember that. The United States is rich in oil, gas, coal. It also has ample wind and solar. So we're pretty distinctive, right? And we have to remember that not every country has it. In fact, most countries don't have that situation. One of the good pieces of news is I think that we've increasingly, both the United States and globally, moved to a much more technology-inclusive approach towards solving the climate challenge. And I think this is incredibly important because different countries have different indigenous resources. Some countries may have fossil fuels, and so their path may be, at least for a while, with carbon capture and storage and substituting toward relatively lower emission fossil fuels. We need to recognize that. Many countries don't have a lot of land resources, so they can't build the wind and solar that we can build in the United States. They may need nuclear power, or they may, maybe they can do enhanced geothermal. So having a technology-inclusive approach is really important. The other thing is to recognize is that different countries are entering this in different stages of development. And so while there is an increasing commonality of an end goal to net zero emissions of our energy system, the starting point and how we'll get there is going to be different for different countries. And that's incredibly important to remember as we think about the innovation challenge and as we interact with other countries around the world.
Yeah, thanks for that, Richard. I think fossil fuel dependencies, and you were alluding to this a minute ago, were one of the key defining attributes of the energy geopolitics over the past few decades. As we move forward on the innovation agenda, trying to conceptualize, develop, commercialize new clean energy technologies, it's poised to shake up some of the traditional manifestations of thought on energy geopolitics. And one of the things, Robin, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about is lowering the green premium, not just to make clean energy technologies more affordable here in the United States, but also all around the world. What will it mean for geopolitics to have an increased ability of all countries to be able to buy or even manufacture new clean energy technologies? How is that going to reshape the global geopolitical environment as we move forward?
Well, I think no surprise it could be hugely consequential. As we've already discussed a lot, I think the recent history of the world has been one that's been very much optimized around fossil fuel extraction. And you see that in the ways that nation states have wielded influence, right? The reason Saudi Arabia can show up on the world stage and make demands is that it has still quite a lot of market share as an oil producer. And then conversely, I don't know how many of you have read the book The Prize. It's fantastic, but talked about how the reason that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor was because of resource insecurity, and they were really worried about being cut off from access to jet fuel, and so they wanted to make the first move. So you see this behavior time and time again in the history of nation-state interactions, and I think the ability to break out of that paradigm through diversification and innovation would be consequential not just for us, but a variety of allies and partners who have their own ambitions, right, to be not dependent on partners that they'd like to be on different terms with. So in terms of what that looks like, I think the U.S. is now at a point where we have a really thoughtful industrial strategy, right? We've passed the infrastructure bill, about $100 billion going to a variety of clean energy projects as well as grid infrastructure. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, hundreds of billions of dollars going into a variety of things across the value chain, everything from minerals inputs to tax credits to make projects more bankable. as well as thinking about how do we, as Richard said, not just invest on the energy side, but equipment through things like the Advanced Manufacturing Tax Credit. And then we have the CHIPS bill that'll be putting tens of billions of dollars into regional innovation hubs. So us being able to make the most of that investment, bring down the cost of technology rapidly, and then use the levers that we talked about earlier to include trade, supply chain partnerships, technology licensing agreements. I think all of that will redound to the benefit of other countries that want to, again, be more in charge of their own destiny.
Tim, just to sort of bring sort of two themes together here. One is this idea about the fact that, coming geopolitical conflict will likely touch on countries' vulnerabilities and dependencies on fossil fuel. And the transition to more diversified sources of energy probably puts those countries in a more secure position. And I think one of the things that was that sort of has underpinned the success of the price cap policy, which of course, again, is sort of based on countries being able to import crude and refined product, was still that there was an alignment of incentives between us, the United States, and the G7, seeking to reduce the levels of money that Russia was making, and with oil importing countries who now had leverage actually to lower the cost of their energy imports because they could now negotiate with Russia on lower prices, and that's in fact what they did. But I think in those two things, there's a potential confluence of interests that is beneficial to the energy transition. And the other thing that I would say is that these big geopolitical shocks also can force change in a very quick way that was unexpected. And I think, the United States talked to Germany for years and years and years about their dependence on Russian energy and Nord Stream 2. And what you saw following the invasion of Ukraine was a very rapid transition away from the importation of Russian oil, which of course they don't, the European Union imports sort of de minimis amounts at this point, but also a very rapid transition to developing their LNG capacities.
And let's just stay with you for a second. So we've been talking a lot about carrots, and I know your job involves primarily sticks, and there's been some innovation in that regard. What are the next generation of, if you will use this metaphor, sticks in energy geopolitics? What will the next generation of those look like for the United States and our allies?
Yeah, I think we will continue to be challenged to find ways in which to bring meaningful pressure to bear on our major adversaries that, to put very simply, is more painful for them than it is for us. One of the reasons I think the conversation about how the price cap has worked is important for this audience is because it resulted in a reordering in how global oil flows were actually happening. So once Russia could no longer export to Europe, its largest market, it then had to find other ways to get oil to the market, which could have represented a very big disruption. But the work that the Treasury Department did to really sort of work hand in glove with industry to create a policy that worked meant that oil found its other channels, and we avoided that sort of massive disruption that could have come from the United States saying, well, we're just putting in place this policy, you can't use our services, you have to sell at $60, and is Russia going to have an incentive to do that? And it did. It had an incentive to do that because it needed to continue to sell oil. It just wasn't going to get as much money to do it. But I think what that points to, Tim, is that we will continue to have to find ways that are quite purpose-designed to ensure that we are targeting our pain, particularly on the energy side, at our adversaries, and not at ourselves, and certainly not at our partners, and certainly not at the global south.
Tim, I sort of have a question, maybe not to take your job, but to the panel, and I think generally one that I've been sort of grappling with at this conference, and it's always good to come to something like this where you're stimulated to think in a way that you don't get to at work sometimes. But it's the size of the carrot, and if we're really thinking of the carrots as big enough or large enough. Richard mentioned this sort of having an aperture wider, thinking about how energy transition happens in some of these countries, either in the global north or global south, and then thinking about how we help them. Robin mentioned green steel in Indonesia as an example. But in the absence of being able to do free trade agreements, having a trade dispute with Brazil around ethanol, are we really going to support biofuels in Brazil and their energy transition? Are we going to, the carrot of saying industrialization and green steel when we have a whole steel industry here in the United States, can we really afford to do that? If we believe in resiliency through diversity, because all of these companies or all these countries are sort of becoming resource nationalists as well. They don't want just the energy, they want to produce. It's not just Saudi sending oil now, they want to make all the byproducts. We talked about processing in the United States, in Quebec. What about processing in some of these other countries? Are we going to support that as well? So something I grapple with, because sometimes it feels like the carrot's not large enough, but nor can we go to the hill and ask for more money or find ways to de-risk more private investment. But it's just sort of a concern. I'd be curious what others think as well.
I mean, I'll just say that one of the things that comes to mind, which has come up implicitly, and I think we have a side table on this later on, which is the nexus of climate and trade. So if one thinks about a carrot, being able to participate in the global trading system and benefit from that trade is an incredibly important carrot, right, for all countries in the world. And so if we can rationalize meeting the economic development goals of having great trade with our environmental goals and our energy security goals, I think that has a lot of opportunity to turn this from a stick into a carrot. It also directly relates to some of the conversations around trusted value chains and friendshoring and so on. And so, as the global trade regime evolves, it's going to be much more not only about kind of open and free trade. It's going to be about coupling that with other societal desires like decreasing carbon intensity. And so, final point on this: when I think about renewable fuels or forestry in Brazil as part of the global climate solution, having better metrics and verification of the decarbonization value of those things, having more rational and interoperable trading system around the measurement of carbon in traded goods, I think are going to be incredibly important underpinnings for us to kind of see mutual value across national boundaries on this.
So I think our time has expired. Any closing thoughts, Anna or Robin?
Just the picture looks complicated. There are a lot of different, I think, interests here that we're trying to balance on this panel. And I think, as Vinay said and a number of other people have said, it's a real benefit to get to talk about these things outside of Washington and to be able to sort of find the synergies that we might not otherwise have found just by sitting in our silos.
And I think I'll close by saying I agree with everything that Richard just said in the way of how we make this work in emerging markets, and that I think it is a little bit facetious to pretend that if we haven't even done clean steel here yet, that we're going to go straight to Indonesia and make it work there. But again, I think Richard put it well, that if we can make development dollars work in conjunction with a climate-aligned trade strategy where there's mutual market access benefit, I think that is how we win and achieve the goals that we outlined earlier: energy security, sustainable development, and national security. So I'll leave it there.
I want to thank our terrific panel for a great conversation, and I'll